Welcome, Campfire Crew. Let's get it on. What My Daughter Saw, submitted by O. Henry 12. My family always went camping as a rule. I grew up that way and continued the tradition with my own family. We would go to a lot of different places with our gear and enjoy nature for what it was instead of doing things like Disneyland and stuff like that. When my daughter was born in 1996, my wife and I took her for her first camping trip. She was great on it, and we decided that because she was that good, we knew she could handle it, and we were going to make camping a family thing going forward. And we did. We went on a ton of trips and had a lot of fun. When my daughter was 10, we took a camping trip to a state park in the state I'm from. It was just like a lot of other places that we had been, and it was just for the weekend, so it wasn't anything super fancy. It was just a quick getaway from home and work. When we got there weren't many others tent camping in our area that we stayed at. We did see other people in the cabin area, of course, and there were other people out there, but no one was within 4 or 5 campsites from us on either side. After setting up camp, we were all sitting at a picnic table trying to decide what to do with the day. Go to the little lake that was in the park, go on a hike, or whatever. While we were chatting away, a camp mug that I had set down on the picnic table suddenly slid across it and fell off of it on the far end. All of us looked at it and thought, geez, that's weird. I mean, there was no wind, and we were all sitting pretty calmly and not rocking the table back and forth. There was really no explanation as to why that mug slid all the way across the table. I tried to make a joke out of it and said, oh, this campsite must be haunted, and it made my daughter and wife laugh. I just picked up the mug, put it back on the table, and we forgot about it. We opted for a hike, and that's what we did. We were gone for about 2 or 3 hours, and when we returned to camp, it was time to eat, so I set up my camp stove and also started getting a fire going. I was going to roast corn and potatoes in the fire and fry up some fish that we had purchased fresh that morning. As I was getting the fire going, I looked at my camp stove, and it was one of those green Coleman white gas ones. You know, the kind that folds up on the side and has 3 burners? Well, as I was looking at it, it collapsed, the lid slammed down, and again, there was no wind. I couldn't figure out how it happened, but I figured maybe I just hadn't set it up properly. So I walked over to the picnic table where it was set up, put the sides in their slots again, and then went back to the fire. Before I even got to it, I heard the lid on the stove slam down again. Of course, when I turned around, it's exactly what I saw. The stove had collapsed again. I didn't know what to think, but for whatever reason, I just got the fire going and then went back to the stove, set it up again, and continued on with my meal prep. I didn't mention this to my wife, and certainly didn't mention it to my daughter. I just got our food taken care of without any further incident, and then we sat around the campfire that evening without anything else happening. When we woke up in the morning, I was going to the communal bathroom to get cleaned up while my wife and daughter got their breakfast stuff together. She had just taken my daughter to the showers and was coming back when I was leaving. We were going to have cereal, a huge hit with my daughter. You know those little boxes of cereal that you can turn into a bowl? The big variety pack. I love those things myself. My daughter chose a box and set it on the picnic table while my wife went to our cooler to get milk. Suddenly, the box basically exploded, throwing cereal all over the place. My daughter screamed and fell back off the picnic bench she was on. She was so scared. Now, there was no sound, just the box popping open and shooting the cereal all over. I came running back when I heard my daughter scream. My wife said she didn't know what happened. She hadn't seen anything. Her back had been turned while she was getting the milk, and when she turned around, all she saw was the cereal all over the table. I'm a pretty skeptical guy, but this was getting really odd. Too many goofy things were happening for my liking. So I calmly got another box of cereal for my daughter, told my wife it was no big deal, and something must have happened with the packaging of the cereal that made it do that. I don't know. I was grasping at straws at this point. We ate a quick breakfast and decided to go down to the lake for the morning, and we did. But we didn't talk about what had happened. We just wanted to enjoy the summer day at this little beach on the lake. We went back to our campsite and just got in the truck to go to a lunch place a few miles outside of the park. After we ate, we wandered around this little town that was really cute, looking in the shops and such. But all the while, I kept thinking about the weird stuff that was happening at our campsite. How in the hell could all of that stuff actually be happening? I mean, we weren't imagining it. It was really happening. Eventually, we went back to the campsite for dinner, and as I was getting it ready, my wife took my daughter to the shower house to get cleaned up. I wasn't talking about it to either of them, and I was really preoccupying all my thoughts, though. It was just so strange. I mean, what was happening? Or rather, what had happened earlier? So, nothing happened during dinner, and I built another fire for us to enjoy. We were going to be heading home in the morning, and we just wanted to have one more fun night. So while we sat around the campfire, it got dark, and I was just telling funny family stories, and my daughter was talking about going into the 5th grade. She was really excited to go back to school to see her friends. Suddenly, she stopped and stared over my shoulder into the forest behind me. "What's up, sweetie?" I asked her. Her eyes got big, and suddenly she just screamed her head off. I mean, it literally made me jump out of my lawn chair. My wife screeched a little too, she was taken aback so much. She held my daughter's hand while I whirled around to see what the heck she had just seen. There was nothing there, but my daughter was still crying, and I had to ask her again, "Sweetheart, what did you just see?" Through her tears and blubbering, she said, "A man, Dad, a bloody man." Again, I looked over at the forest, walked to the edge of it, and even went into the trees for a little bit, but there was no one there. I went back to the campfire and said, "Sweetie, there's no one there. Are you sure that's what you saw?" She nodded her head and said, "Dad, there was a bloody man standing there just watching us." Well, that was it. My wife decided that we were leaving right then and there, and I agreed as I didn't want my daughter to spend the night terrified out there. I started to pack everything up, took the tent down, and my wife and daughter just sat by the fire. Then my wife got up to help me get everything into my truck. Once we were loaded, we got in for the drive home. As I was backing out of our campsite onto the little road that would lead us out of the park, my headlights illuminated the forest behind our site, and my blood ran cold. There was a bloody man standing at the edge of the forest, but he wasn't really all there, if you know what I mean. He was kind of transparent, the typical ghost kind of thing that you hear about. I couldn't believe it was happening. I blinked, looked back up, but the man was gone. I'm telling you, I know he was there, and I saw him as plain as day. I didn't say anything about it to my wife or daughter. We drove home and got in bed, everyone a little shaken up still, and we were talking about what had happened at the campsite. Finally, I put a stop to it, saying that we were all very tired, and all we were doing was getting ourselves worked up even more. My wife agreed, and my daughter didn't really want to talk about it anymore either. The next day, I called the ranger's office at the park to let them know what was going on at that campsite, at the risk of them thinking I was crazy. The ranger was an older guy who listened to me, and when I actually told him, "Look, man, don't think I'm crazy," he paused for a moment and then said, "You're not. And you're not the first person to tell us of something strange happening at that loop of campsites." He then went on to tell me that 20 years before, a guy who was camping there by himself was attacked and mauled by a bear. He laid there by himself, sustaining a lot of injuries before someone found him and took him to the hospital, but sadly, even though he did get to the hospital, he lost his life. I can't imagine what it's like to be mauled by a bear, and I don't want to think about it. The ranger didn't say that what I saw and the guy were connected. He just made mention that a guy had been killed out there. I didn't tell my wife or daughter about that right away, and I kept it to myself. When my daughter was 18 or so, I did let them know what the ranger had told me, and they were both shocked. I am convinced that the spirit of that poor bastard is still out there in that park at those campsites. I only wish we hadn't seen him. My encounter with the wild man. My eyes were open, but all I could see was darkness, pure black. A vague cloud of charcoal swirled in front of my eyes, and I struggled to gain focus. I knew where I was, but I was unable to do anything about it. I was laying on my back, incapable of movement, and my heart was racing, and pounding more like it. I was frozen solid, sweating, and scared out of my mind. My eyes were the only thing I seemed to have control of, and even then, they were failing me. I had been in this frozen, pitch-black state for what seemed like an eternity, but in reality, it was only a matter of seconds. I had woken in an instant, and before I was even fully awake, knew what was going on. I could sense the danger and smell the rancid breeze before my brain could even realize what was happening. The situation was this. I was alone, hundreds of miles from civilization, camping in a small one-man tent during a month-long bicycle tour across British Columbia, Canada. I was in a tent, all alone, in the middle of a vast forest, and I was frozen solid. From inside my sleeping bag cocoon, I could sense the movement of a large, sulphurous animal making its way through the brush on the left side of my tent, no more than 30 feet away. I could hear the animal's footsteps as the weight of the creature pressed down on a thick layer of dead leaves and soft earth. I've spent more than a decade camping in remote locations all around the world, so I've heard large animals moving through the forest at night. I've seen deer, moose, elk, bear, raccoons, wolves, bobcats, and even mountain lions. But this was nothing like those other animals. This thing was huge, was clearly walking through the trees on 2 massive feet, and it was getting closer to my tent. Seconds passed, but they seemed like hours. I tried not to breathe, fearing the animal might hear me and come closer to investigate, but in the back of my mind, I knew that whatever was out there was already well aware of my presence. I hoped that the creature would get bored and eventually go away, so I tried to slow my breathing, and I waited. The stillness is what scared me the most. The forest was so quiet, unnaturally quiet. There were no singing birds, no critters crawling. The wind wasn't blowing, and the nearby brooks were silent. All I could hear was my rapid heartbeat and every slow breath. But then, just as I thought I had been imagining the entire thing, a branch cracked, and there was a quick shuffle in the brush on the left side of my tent. That's when I realized that this was actually happening. When I was in 6th grade, I had written a 2-page paper about Bigfoot. I had watched a bunch of documentaries on the History Channel and subsequently became fascinated with the creature. Fascinated and frightened. When my father took me hiking through the Sierra Nevada mountain range a year later, I excelled in the wild, but was scared of going off on my own, not out of fear of wild animals like bear or moose, but because I thought I might run into Bigfoot. Years later, I realized just how silly it had been of me to believe that Bigfoot was a real-life creature. After all, no good evidence for the beast seems to exist. Casts of massive footprints have been taken, and shaky video evidence shows little of any true living creature. So when I grew to the age where I could think for myself, I let Bigfoot go. I traveled the world, spent years roaming around by myself in forests, deserts, and jungles, and never once did I see any evidence for a massive, hairy monkey man living in the woods. That is, of course, until this very moment, when I knew in an instant that something huge was stalking me as I lay in my tent in the woods of British Columbia. I couldn't yet see the beast, but I knew that it was there. Still on my back and covered in darkness, I lay listening. Even the slightest movement of the animal could be heard and felt. The forest is funny like that. When you're laying on the ground, you can even feel the slightest footstep of a creature on the other side of the forest. The earth moves, and you can feel it. And I was on high alert, so my body was picking up on everything. That's when the creature moved again. There was a loud crack in the brush, and my heart instantly began fluttering. It was like going from 60 to 110 in a millisecond, and all it took was a single step by an animal no more than 20 feet away from my tent. One step is all it took. That's all I needed to shock me back into reality. I was completely alone, trapped inside my sleeping bag, laying on the ground inside a thin layer of tent, and I had no way of defending myself. I had a knife in one of my panniers, but in order to get my knife, I'd need to first unzip my sleeping bag, and even if I could do that without attracting the attention of the animal, I still had to find the knife inside of one of my panniers, crawl out of my tent, and prepare to put up a fight. The odds were against me, so instead, I just stayed where I was and listened. The silence is what made this experience so frightening. The animal would take a step, sometimes two, and then it would just sit there and not move. And we'd both be listening. Me listening to it, and it listening to me. And when one of us moved, the other would too. I'd take a deep breath or shift my body just an inch or two, and the creature would move forward, one slow step at a time. A few minutes passed, but it felt like an eternity. I could tell that the animal was getting closer. Its stench was horrific, but its presence was even more frightening. Even though I couldn't actually see the animal, I could feel just how big it was. The earth rumbled in a slow, almost monstrous tone each time the animal moved one of its feet and laid them to rest in the leaves outside of my tent. I could smell the wet air surrounding this beast and practically taste the dirt and disease that hung off this creature's body. Its filth would be apparent from several hundred feet away, but by now it was no more than 10 feet from where I was lying. It was so close to me now that I could hear it breathing. My heart was racing, my face was dripping with sweat, and I was sure this was going to be the moment that my life came to an end. My whole life flashed before my eyes. I thought about what it might be like for my friends and family to never know what happened to me. They'd have a hard time finding me, after all. I was camped out in the middle of the forest far from home. I hadn't really told anyone where I'd be, and I'd hiked back from the main road several hundred feet. It would be weeks or months before anyone found my tent and bicycle in these dense trees. It would be weeks or months before anyone found my tent and bicycle in these dense trees, let alone my body. The creature moved forward again, and now it was just inches from the outside of my tent. It was massive, and it cast a faint shadow on the exterior of my tent, and I could see just how big this animal truly was. It was huge. Even though I had already accepted my fate, I decided to give myself one last chance at life. I wasn't going to lie down and die. I was going to fight. So, just as I saw this animal's massive hand reaching towards my tent, I sat up inside my sleeping bag and screamed. Whatever it was ran away. I never found out what it was. I just listened to its heavy footsteps walk, or more to the point, run from my tent. In the morning, I woke up, packed my things, and continued on my journey through the Sierra Nevada. I never heard from whatever that was, whatever thing that was, again. Messed Up Camping Trip, submitted by Jenny O412. Hey, this happened to me in the summer of 2015. A group of my friends decided to go camping and hiking at this trail about an hour from our home. Where it was is not important, but what happened out there is. I probably should be more forthcoming about the name of the trail and the state that I'm telling this story from, but I don't want anybody to know who I am. It's not that I'm worried about myself, I just don't want any publicity. Our group got together, and we all got our stuff ready to go when we were ready to head out to the trail and go camping. There were 4 of us, 2 couples. Me, I'll call myself Jenny. My boyfriend I will call Todd, my friend Krista, and her boyfriend I'll call Bob. We were planning on hiking and camping along this trail that was a loop of about 30 miles. We were going to take it easy and go around it in about 10-mile increments. We would stop after 10 miles, set up camp at a site we could find that was open, and just hang out and have a few glasses of wine or whiskey as we enjoyed the wilderness and our company. We hit the trailhead and made our way to our first stop. There was no one there at the lean-to when we got there, and we were excited that we would be out there with just the 4 of us. Totally stoked, we set up camp. The guys got a fire going for our campfire cheer. My boyfriend Todd broke out a bottle of wine and poured everyone a glass. Right, don't take us as massive drunks, but we had an entire backpack full of wine that Todd had carried on his chest. Yeah, lulz. Anyway, we all had a few glasses of wine, and we were just winding down watching the sunset over the trees, when we heard the snap and footsteps of someone coming up the trail towards the campsite. It was this guy. He looked disheveled and smelly, to say the least. I mean, frankly, he looked like a homeless guy that I would see on the downtown streets of the city that we lived in. Not wanting to be rude or be jerks, we invited him over to have some of our meal, which now involved hot dogs. This guy sat down, thanked us, and said that he was hiking from the north to the south all the way across the United States. He was interested in taking pictures of every place that he had been and the people that he would meet, so he asked us while he ate a hot dog if he could take pictures of us. Well, like I said, we were a couple of glasses of wine deep, so we said sure. He asked us our names, and we told him our first names but not our last names. I think we all felt that that would have been a little weird. He took some pictures of us, had another hot dog and a cookie, and then said he was going to continue to walk down the trail for another couple of miles while it was still light out. As it was dusk, it was starting to get dark while we watched the sunset, but there was still enough light for him to walk down the trail. We didn't think anything of it until Krista said, "Do you guys think that guy was weird?" I told her that he was probably just some guy that was hiking and we shouldn't think too much about it. But yeah, he did look kind of spaced out. The guys just said he looked like some dude who was high on life and probably high on the ganj and just enjoying some of his time out in the woods. I wish that had been the case, because what happened next is the reason I sent you this story. We all went to sleep a little bit later that night after taking care of our food and putting it in a bear bag and hoisting it up into a tree, and then letting the fire die down. We crawled into our tents for a much-needed sleep to get ready for the next day. But when we woke up, we all found out that leaving our boots outside of our tent was a bad idea, because the laces of our boots had been removed. I mean, literally, they were stolen. They had been taken. We couldn't find them anywhere around our campsite, and there was absolutely no reason that we would have done that on our own as a prank. But, nonetheless, all of our bootlaces were gone. I looked at my boyfriend and said, "Todd, what the hell are we going to do now?" Todd, being the everlasting woodsman and outdoor freak, said that he actually brought extra laces, but only for 2 pairs of boots. We talked about what we were going to do, and I figured that there was a little town off the trail about 3 miles away that someone could go and get extra laces. I mean, at least that's what we were hoping. So for the next few miles until we got to that cross trail, Todd and Bob wore boots with no laces, and they were struggling. It's tough enough walking on an off-road trail, but without laced-up boots, it made it that much harder. When we got to the cross trail, which was actually a logging road, we switched laces and gave them to Krista and Bob and told them to run as fast as they could to town, which was about a mile away, and see if we could get extra laces. During that time, my boyfriend and I just hung out. Todd, God bless him, was feeling a little frisky and wanted to have a roll in the grass. We were pretty stinky from the hike so far, but I obliged, and that's exactly what we did. Right? Full disclosure, I'm married now, but I still think of that time with him, and I'm pretty sure he does too. I hope that doesn't make me a slut. At any rate, Krista and Bob came back about an hour after we had made love, and they had extra laces. They weren't really the laces for our boots that we needed, but they were the kind that were waxy and would do for the rest of our trip. So we set off again for the next campsite, and none of us talking about who took our laces or what had happened during the night. As a matter of fact, Bob said that it was probably squirrels or some other forest animal that took them. We all laughed about that, but hey, who knows? We went down the trail to the next campsite, and again, when we got there, there was no one there. So we set up the same way we had the night before. We indulged in more noodles and, of course, more wine and whiskey. That's when we heard someone coming up the trail behind us. And no shit, it was the same guy from the day before. He looked the same, and we couldn't blame him because we were all wearing the same clothes too. But there he was in our midst again and acting like he had never seen us before. He gave us the same spiel as before, and we didn't know what to do other than go along with it, so we did. We gave him some food, and he ate some more that he had brought, and then once again he asked us to take some pictures. At this point I was kind of wigged out and looked at Todd with a, "Hey, let's walk over there so we can talk" look. You know, the eyebrow thing. He picked up on it, and we walked away from everybody else to talk. Immediately Todd said, "Is this fucking happening? Are we seriously talking to this guy again?" I told him I felt the same way, and that's why I wanted to get away from everyone to talk about this. He said he was not okay with what was going on, but didn't want to have a huge confrontation. I told him we should just sit on it and see what happened and then go from there, even though I was kind of freaking out. Todd said that he was going to keep his 9mm on his hip from now on, rather than keeping it in his pack, and that's what he did. We went back to our campsite, Todd got his gun, and we stoked up another fire, and once again the guy wandered away up the trail. When we were sure he was out of hearing range, Todd and I talked to Krista and Bob about the whole thing, and they too were wondering what the hell was going on. That's when Krista pointed to a white piece of something on the trail, and I ran over to it. It was a Polaroid of me and my boyfriend going at it. We were kind of embarrassed, but I snatched it out of her hand, stuck it in my pack, and just said, "Oh well, I guess that guy's a shutterbug," trying to play the whole thing off, meanwhile terrified into my heart. We relaxed, had another glass of wine, but a little while later we heard some horrific screaming coming from the woods, but we couldn't tell where it was coming from. They weren't human screams. They were screams of an animal. I don't know how to really describe it, but it wasn't like a human being screaming. I mean, now there's lots of animals out in that territory. I've never heard anything like that before. And Todd said we should just go to sleep, get up early, and get moving. He was going to stay up late by the fire to watch over things, because he was feeling uneasy. He didn't actually say he was feeling uneasy, but I know what he was going after when he said he was going to stay up late. He wanted to protect us. The next morning, we all woke up, packed up quick, and got ready for the next part of our trek. This was our last leg through the woods before we got to a little town where we were going to stay at a motel and then get a ride back to our car. About 2 miles from the last campsite, we noticed something funny on the trees on the side of the trail. It was something I had never seen before, but the guys recognized the guts and the stomach of an animal. They were both hunters. Todd and Bob knew right away that something was out of the ordinary as these guts were hanging from the trees and stretched out to their maximum length. Krista and I didn't say anything. We were just walking along past them. Todd and Bob kind of lolled behind and then whispered something to one another. We kept walking, but I couldn't help notice that Bob also took his handgun out of his pack and holstered it. We continued walking down the trail, and we were all really feeling weirded out. I mean, something was just not right, And I'm not just talking about the stuff that was hanging in the trees or all the other stuff. We just didn't feel alone anymore. All that crap with the weirdo showing up 2 nights in a row had our minds racing. And none of us brought it up or spoke about it, but I know we were all thinking it. I mean, I know that because that's what we talked about after this whole ordeal. As we got to the main road that would take us back to the motel, we kind of stopped, and we looked back down the trail. And there he was, standing in the middle of it, with his camera up, still taking pictures of us. That guy. That creepy weirdo guy. I couldn't help but notice that his hands had blood on them. We all stood there looking at him for at least 30 seconds before he raised his hand, which was bloody, and he waved at us and then turned around and just walked back down the trail. I looked at Todd and just said, "What the fuck?" And we all decided to hightail it to the motel. We didn't even stay there. We all took showers, got cleaned up, and then called a cab company for a ride back to our car. We didn't want to spend one more instant out in that space. Who knows what the fuck that guy was doing, but holy shit, we know he was following us, and we know he was taking pictures of us the entire time. I still have that Polaroid of me on top of Todd. I hate to think that my face and the face of all my friends is somehow tacked up in some shack in the middle of the woods owned by that guy. I mean, seriously, it's been years, but what a fucking creep. Lost. Submitted by Bebopalula. This story doesn't have any ghosts or monsters or Bigfoot or whatever, but it's the scariest thing that ever happened to me. When I was in my 20s, I was engaged to be married, and a couple of months before the wedding, my fiancée decided she didn't want to get married anymore, basically gave me back the ring, and then took off to Florida. We lived in Colorado at the time, and she just up and took off. It blew me away, and blew everyone away. Her parents were pissed, my family was dumbstruck, and all of her friends were completely WTF. Anyway, you can imagine I was kind of in the dumps. I needed to get away from everything, and my job was really cool when they found out what happened. They allowed me to take time off and not charge me for vacation. I mean, they knew how upset I was. I thought that was really cool. I still talk to a lot of those people and my old boss to this day. After lounging around the house for a day or two feeling terrible and sorry for myself, I decided to go on a hiking trip and do a little camping, and I figured I could go out and just clear my head and do some thinking about where my life was headed. So I gathered up my gear, I had to buy some other stuff, loaded up my pack, and off I went. I told my parents and my brother where I was headed, and they just said to be safe. At first, my mom tried to talk me out of going by myself, but she saw that I really needed to be alone and figure things out. I arrived at a trailhead midday, and it was a couple-hour drive for me to get where I wanted to go, so, leaving my car behind, I began to make my trek. I brought enough provisions for about 3 days and figured I would connect some of the trails to extend the hike. The first day was awesome, and I saw a couple of people also hiking, but I learned from them that the trail I was on had pretty light usage and I wouldn't really be seeing a lot of people. In a way that made me feel good because I didn't want to be around people, but at the same time, it also made me a little nervous that I wouldn't be seeing a lot of folks, and without being too negative and thinking something bad would happen, I was conscious of the fact that if something did go wrong, I'd be in trouble. Truth be told, trouble is what I eventually found myself in. I stopped to camp as the sun was going down and figured I would just set up my little Whisperlight stove and make some noodles. I was just going to bivvy out there and not sleep in a tent, although I did bring one. After I ate, I cleaned up and sat back with a bottle of Maker's Mark and just sat thinking about everything that was happening to me. After a bit, I went to sleep, and the next day brought more of the same. Great hiking, awesome views, some interesting people who wanted to stop and chat, but they were few and far between. I camped again as the sun was going down, trying to relax and think about where I was headed, and I know it was early on in this whole thing with my ex-fiancée taking off, but I was starting to look at her a little differently and put things into perspective. I was working hard about not being angry with her and trying to just focus on myself. I realized that wasting time on a person like that is just that, wasted time. The next morning, I noticed the skies getting dark and was thinking I should start heading back and maybe take some trails towards my car, so the next day I'd be able to complete the hike and get into my car and go home. Unfortunately, the rain came, and this was not just rain. This was a hell of a thunderstorm. I don't know if you've ever been out in that area, but you can see the storms coming, and you can see the lightning and you can hear the thunder, and it's really beautiful, to be honest, but also kind of scary, especially when you know you're out in the middle of nowhere without shelter. I found a little outcropping of rocks and held up there as the really heavy stuff came down. I just sat there listening to the thunder boom all around me. Man, it was so loud. After a while, the rain stopped and I started my hike again, and looking at an old map, I thought I would take a shortcut that would get me back to my car a little faster. I would have one more night to stay out there, but I figured this would save me some time. I mean, I was having a blast, but I was also at that point where I was ready to go home. So, off I went down this trail. I realized, after about an hour, that something was not right about it. It didn't really feel like a trail anymore. It was kind of like bushwhacking, but not really serious bushwhacking. I mean, it just didn't feel like a trail. I guess that's the only way I can describe it. Up to this point, everything I was walking on had been clearly defined, and you could tell that people used it all the time. I was now on something that looked like no one had been out there for years. So I stopped, looked at this crappy map that I had brought, and thought if I made a beeline straight away from this trail, I would find another trail that would get me back to where I needed to be. I started to make my way across between these two trails that the map said were there, and realized pretty fast that this was probably a really stupid idea. I had my compass out, but the way I was walking, I was kind of zigzagging all over the place and not being able to keep a straight direction. Part of that was due to the terrain. It just wasn't a straight shot like I thought it was going to be. So I'm out there thinking that I'm heading in the right direction. Not realizing that I'm not, but my compass says I am. Night's starting to fall, and I realize I'm going to have to stay out here, even though there's no ideal places to stop. After finding a somewhat decent place, I stopped, ate something, and realized that in the morning I was going to have to figure something out because this map was useless now. It was kind of useless to begin with. I was pissed off at myself for making a stupid decision like this instead of staying on the trail. If there's any moral of the story in this, it's stay on the trail. In the morning, I woke up and looked at that dumb map again for whatever reason. I got my bearings, checked my compass, and started heading in a direction that I knew there had to be a trail. I walked and walked and walked all day long and did not come across any trail. I couldn't figure out how this was humanly possible. I mean, it didn't make any sense. There had to be something out there, no matter what direction I went in, but I wasn't coming across anything or anyone. I started to realize I was on the edge of being really screwed. I remember sitting down to try to think things through and keep calm. That's another moral of the story. Keep calm. I did, but at this point I knew I was lost, and I didn't know how I was going to get out of here. It kind of felt like I was in the Blair Witch Project, where the people are walking around and around, and they're just going in circles. That wasn't the exact case with me, it just felt like that. Night was coming again, and I thought to myself, well, I'm going to have to stay out here again until I can figure out where the hell I'm going. So I stopped and noticed that I was going to be running out of food real soon. I did bring extra, knowing that something always could go wrong, but I didn't think I was going to have anything go wrong. Now, here I was. I slept as best as I could and woke up with the sun and started off in an easterly direction. I mean, there had to be a trail out there. But as I had no idea where I was kind of scared. I stayed positive and made my way, but it's hard to shake that feeling when you're not seeing any progress and you feel like you're really lost. I walked and walked again, and still nothing. I came up on a little hill and saw a lake in the distance and figured I would make my way towards the lake, as for whatever reason in my head, I thought that a trail had to go to the lake. Yeah, that's the way I was thinking, not super rational. I made for the lake, and just like anything else and anyone who's been out in the woods or out hiking, everything looks a hell of a lot closer than it really is. I figured I'd be there in an hour or so, but after 2 hours of walking, I still had not found my way to the lake following my compass direction. Night was falling again, and now I knew I was really in trouble. That night I barely slept at all. I'm a grown man, and I'm not going to lie. I was scared to the point of tears. I was frustrated and mad at myself for being an idiot and going off the trail. I finally dozed off and woke up angry. I was not going to sit around feeling sorry for myself. I was going to make this happen and get the hell out of there. Thankfully, after a half day of walking, I did come across a trail. I had no idea where it led, but I was just happy to be on something that was defined. I started walking, hoping to run into someone who could tell me where the hell I was, and thank God that actually happened. A young couple was coming up the trail and saw me and waved. I stopped them and asked what trail I was on, and they told me, then asked if I was okay. They could tell something was wrong. I told them that I had gotten lost and was now trying to figure out how to get back to where my vehicle was. They were really cool, gave me some food that they had, and told me that they had a different map than mine. We looked at it, and I was nowhere near my car. How the hell I got that far away from it, I have no idea. They asked if I would walk with them for a bit in the direction of my car, and I said yes. I needed company at that point. I was over being by myself. We walked along until they were taking a different trail, but now I had an idea of where I was, so that made things a little easier. It did take longer to get to my vehicle, and as a matter of fact, an extra whole day, but I made it to my car, thankful that I did. I didn't realize that my family was at home wondering where the hell I was. All I knew was I was hungry, I was thirsty, and I was miserable. But as I got into my car, I realized something. In the face of adversity, I got out of being lost. I stayed strong and found my way, and I think that was some kind of message or metaphor for where I was in life. Things for me personally were upside down, but I knew at that moment I would get through it, because that's just the way life is. If you work at it, you'll get through it. I left part of me out in that national forest, but I also found a new part of me, one that I had never realized was in me. I'm sure some of your listeners will think this is a cheesy story with a goofy happy ending, but the truth be told, I have never been more scared in my entire life. If you've ever really been lost and you're fighting the feelings that you have when you're out in the middle of nowhere all alone, let me tell you, it's scarier than any horror movie. When your mind wanders and you're thinking, shit, this is it, I'm dead, it's not a fun time. I'll end here. I eventually found another wonderful woman, and we've been happily married for years and have 2 kids. I take them hiking and we all go camping, and I always remind them to stay on the trail and to never lose your cool if you do get lost. Hey gang, hope you enjoyed this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you haven't already, please like, share, subscribe, and click on the little bell for notifications every time I upload something new. Leave a comment in the comment section below, and I'll be sure to get back to you. And if you have a story that you would like me to narrate on this channel, send it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Quick note, I'm going on a little hiatus to enjoy my family and a little bit of the summer, but I will be back with the freshest content that I can bring you. In the meantime, I will have some best ofs for you, and you can find those here and also on my podcast channels. If you're so inclined and would like to help out keeping this channel going ad-free, please visit my website, truescarystories.net. Click on the support button and find out ways that you can help keep the channel rolling. I appreciate everyone who is there, and thanks to all my patrons. It means a lot. Until next time, everyone, be excellent to each other. And remember, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.